Thank you, Dr. Gregorian. You are correct. Justice Sandra Day O'Connor is a national treasure, but you are as well. So we're going to start with our first panel today, and this ought to be exciting. It's a no-holds-barred, very candid discussion about the actual state of our democracy. Have no fear, though, we're not going to spend all day pounding you out about how bad it is. We're then going to move to solutions. Moderating this panel is a broadcasting icon. From CNN, NBC, Bloomberg Television, and now PBS, Judy Woodruff has covered politics and civic life for more than 3 decades. She has also been a longtime advocate for increased civic learning. Please welcome award-winning journalist and PBS NewsHour anchor and managing director, Judy Woodruff.
Thank you so much. I am really glad to be here with all of you this morning to be helping to launch this wonderful program you have planned. It was easy to get away. There's not much news going on in the world today. I'm here because several of my heroes are part of this effort that you're here to talk about and to engage in. First and foremost, I'm always inspired by the words of Vartan Gregorian. Vartan, I have to say, I want to be in the knowledge business and not in the storage business. And I thought that's a line for all of us to remember. And also Ted McConnell, who is over there somewhere, who works very closely with Justice O'Connor on the iCivics initiative. Thank you, Ted. And so many others here. Our job is a modest one this morning to lay out some of the challenges facing our democracy and to talk in broad outlines about the relevance of civic education. And we are so fortunate to have such a sparkling panel to launch this conversation. And I'm going to start on my left with Danielle Allen. She is the James Bryant Conant University professor and director of the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard University. She's a political theorist who has published broadly in democratic theory, political sociology, and the history of political thought. And she's widely known for her work on justice and citizenship in both ancient Athens and modern America. Maybe we can learn some lessons from the Greeks, Danielle. Diana Hess is Dean of the School of Education at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Earlier, she served in a variety of important educational posts and as Senior Vice President of the Spencer Foundation in Chicago. Her research interests include the impact of school-based civic education programs on youth, political and civic engagement. And finally, Daniel Stid, director of the Madison Initiative at the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. He oversees the foundation's 3-year, $50 million effort to improve deliberation, negotiation, and compromise in Congress. He spent many years as a consultant to governments, nonprofits, and private sector leaders. He began his career teaching political science at Wabash College. There's much more about each of them in your program. I encourage you to look at that, but please welcome them right now. So I've been urged to remind all of you that later sessions today are going to delve more deeply into policies and practices for good civics. We're going to try in this hour to address broadly the state of our republic, the relevance of civic learning. I'm just going to start by saying we also want to try to have a conversation about what today's political environment means, the extremely high levels of distrust, not only for government, but for so many of our institutions and even for our fellow Americans. The statistics cited in the white paper that's being released today are incredibly disturbing. For example, only 1 in 5 Americans willing to trust the government in this city, in this country, even in the most difficult, most challenging of time. That percentage is near the lowest proportion ever recorded. In addition, we know that adults are not as engaged in civic activities as they once were. It's in this atmosphere of polarization and distrust that our young people are coming of age. So with that, I'm going to start with Dr. Allen. Danielle, you are one of the nation's leading political theorists. You understand the history of democratic systems. Talk for us a little bit this morning about the breakdown in civic society that we have seen. How did we get here?
Sure, no, thank you, and thanks very much to iCivic's team for the invitation to be here. Thank you, Judy. So I like to use the metaphor that the challenge in front of us is that we have to rebuild the ship while we're sailing on it. I'll say more about the different parts of that, but let me start with the rebuilding the ship part of what currently confronts us. James Madison, in the Federalist Papers, of course, gave us explanations for why the founders thought that the institutions they were designing should serve to secure rights and secure a republic over time. One of the premises of his argument was, for example, that the problem of faction would have as among its solutions the simple fact of geography, the simple fact of the dispersal of the population throughout the country. That premise doesn't hold any longer. And we don't often take the time to note that the premises on which they based their assessment of how to design the institutions themselves may not hold and require reconsideration. So let me just explain what I mean by saying that. So on one level, it's obvious the internet, media technology, and so forth have collapsed geography. It no longer prevents small groups of people with strongly held views from finding each other. Now they can find each other, and so we do have increased levels of factionalized discourse in our public conversation. Another important change is, of course, in the past decade, this country and the world as a whole switched from being majority of people living in rural areas to majority of people living in urban areas. That is a significant demographic change that, again, takes away one of the premises that they use for thinking about how to design their institutions. And then a third thing of a similar sort is just simply the fact of population growth. There were 3 million people in the country when we designed these institutions, and now we're talking about 300 million. So we actually have to give active thought to the question of how we have institutions that mix up the population, that moderate faction, that permit us to synthesize interests in the formation of a common purpose. The received institutions are not actually, in all ways, the obvious solution. So I'm being provocative. We say it was no holds barred conversation. So this is one of the paradoxes here. We're here to talk about civics. We need to educate young people in our current political institutions, absolutely. But at the same time that we do that, we actually need to be recruiting a new generation with the capacities to solve for this problem. All right? So the bar of what's asked of us now is higher than it was previously. So those are some basic big picture issues about how we need to rebuild the ship. Just one more minute and then I'll stop. On the issues of polarization now. You know many of the causes, so I just want to repeat some of them so that they're on our mind for this conversation. We have the obvious problem of the huge change in income distribution, inequality, and wealth inequality over the last 3 decades, and we need to see that as a feature of the causes of polarization. We have the issues of the end of the conscript army, the change to the volunteer army, which means that we don't have a big picture service structure that mixes people from all the different states. We have changes in our institutions of higher education, as Dr. Gregorian said. Among them, that kids who go to elite schools don't go home anymore. And so we don't have any longer a commitment to the creation of regional centers of excellence that combine people from different strata of society, some who have gone away to college and then come home as leaders in their own communities. We have a much more significantly bifurcated society as a result of that. I think there's a lot more to be said about the role that colleges and universities could play and should play in helping to do this work of rebuilding the ship as we're sailing it. And I'm delighted to learn more today about the Lou Fry, I apologize, Lou Fry Institute in Flora. That seems to me a really exemplary case. I was delighted to read about it in the white paper, and I hope that other colleges and universities can take lessons from that and think about how to, again, anchor regional, cross-sectional collaborations to try to rebuild civic engagement.
Terrific. A lot to unpack there. We can talk about some of that this morning, and I know you're going to want to talk about it throughout the day. But let me turn now to Danielle Stid. Dr. Stid, you've been spending a lot of time, of course, most of your time looking at Congress, the issues of partisanship, polarization. Why do you believe polarization or partisanship is at the root of so much of what we're here to talk about today, this problem.
Sure. Well, thanks, Judy, and thanks to the organizers and all the people who've been toiling in these vineyards for many decades. On behalf of the Hewlett Institution, we're very glad to come alongside and support your efforts. I would suggest that the problem is not necessarily partisanship, but hyper-partisanship. And parties are an essential part of a democratic society. If you have a system of majority rule, you need to kind of build a coalition to get a majority, and that involves engaging in partisanship and finding people that see the world the way you do and developing policies and putting those forward. I think one of the problems is over the past 20 or 30 years, in particular, building off of some of the patterns that Danielle observed, we've shifted into more of a hyper-partisan or tribal mode, which is characterized less by something that you're standing for and more by a distrust, a fear, even a hatred of the other. And the animating spirit of politics is how do we stop those other guys? It's not so much I care so much about my side, but I really don't like those other guys. And there's been all sorts of social psychological studies that have borne this out. It presents a huge problem for us in the United States because of the nature of our society and our institutions. Another way in which we need to kind of revisit the founders' assumptions is the tremendous diversity and hence the divisions and the conflict in our society are not a bug but a feature, as we like to say out in Silicon Valley. That was built in at the time that our country was created. No one thought that a republic on a continental scale could work, but they said actually if we, by encompassing so much more diversity, we can actually muffle and baffle the effects that any one point of view might have. But what's happened in this period of polarization is we've kind of sorted ourselves out more and more into two distinct and increasingly entrenched camps. The idea of fluid coalitions and all sorts of groups checking and balancing each other, that's gone by the wayside. So now we've got this intense diversity and division, almost like neatly arrayed and sorted in these two different camps that are lobbing bombs at each other. So that's a problem in itself. It's especially a problem given the complexity of our political institutions. As we learned in civics, we have a separation of powers, we have checks and balances, we have a federal system with multiple veto points. And that institutional complexity is very poorly suited to intensely ideological parties that are not in a position to negotiate and compromise with each other because they see the other side as an enemy of the republic. And this isn't to say that compromise is always a good thing or pretty or elegant, but it just is necessary given our institutional arrangements. And insofar as we've lost the capacity to do that, I think we're at sea, to kind of go back to the original metaphor.
All right, so Dean Hess, we look to the schools to fix all this, to make sure that the next generation doesn't repeat what we see has happened right now. How does that happen? What's the path for us to begin either the K through 12 and at the university level to begin to change this? Because we know children often, they come to school with ideas clearly they've picked up from their families, from their own environment. What's the role of schools?
I'd like to join my panelists in thanking you for this invitation. It's wonderful to be here. So schools have an important role, and I think what we need to be concerned about is to make sure that that role is a force for good and not a force for bad. Schools are powerful institutions. Schools can change our society in ways that are good, or schools can kind of reinscribe what's unfair about our society. So I think what we have to be most concerned about is to make sure that whatever we do in schools with respect to civic education, or quite frankly, any kind of education, needs to be not something that causes society to be less equal, but in fact works on building a better democracy. So I'd like to start out with this premise that the purpose of schools is to build a better democracy. There are other purposes as well. We want students to have healthy lives. We want students to be prepared for the workforce. There's lots of expectations we have of schools. But first and foremost, we have schools and need to continue having schools in order to build a better democracy. And in order to do that, we need to make sure that we take advantage of the many assets that schools have for building a better democracy. So what are some of those? Well, one is that schools obviously have students. And if we want to build the next generation to create a better democracy, to do what Danielle was talking about, we want to go to the place where we're going to have the most reach. And it's not that there aren't other places in which students are being formed civically. We've got lots of examples of wonderful programs that are working in after-school settings, that are working in religious communities, etc. But we know that the vast majority of students spend the vast majority of their day in schools, and that's a wonderful asset. We also know that even though schools are more segregated now than they were 20, 30, and shockingly even 40 years ago, they're still more diverse in many ways than the other places where young people spend time. So we may have schools now that look a little bit like red, blue, and purple states, and we have good research to support that. That there are some schools where the vast majority of students have ideologically homogenous views, and there are schools that look, very, very progressive, schools that look very conservative, and we don't have a lot of schools where you've got the mix we want. That being said, there's more of a mix in schools than we have in other places where young people spend time, and that mix is good, because if we're going to have high quality civic education that builds a better democracy, it needs to be in the most diverse setting we can possibly imagine, not just ideological, but also socioeconomic and racial and ethnic, religious, etc. Schools also have teachers who either are or can be prepared to do the very hard work of both creating and pulling off high quality civic education, which is not easy, and it's especially not easy now in this time of hyperpartisanship. I had a teacher say to me a couple months ago that in a lesson that involved looking at articles from a variety of newspapers, a student said, "I refuse to read that article from the New York Times because that's fake news. So I won't read that." That was very concerning to me. The teacher said, "What do I do about that?" I don't have a good answer to that, but I do know that that is a fairly new phenomenon. In addition to having teachers who could become well prepared or already are well prepared to pull off high quality civic education, we have actually in this country a lot of really great curriculum. And so even though we do need innovation, we do need to do some things we haven't done before, it's not that we have a curricular civic desert. So if you read the report yet, you know that we have these civic deserts across the United States, places where young people and older people have few opportunities to civically engage. We have some schools that are civic deserts as well, but we don't have a curricular civic desert. We actually have wonderful resources that could be employed to teach young people what they need to learn. So in a nutshell, I would say that what we need to make sure is that while we're building the ship, while sailing the ship, or flying the plane while redoing the plane, whatever that is, we have to make sure that in schools, we make sure that schools are a force for good and that schools are a force for building democracy. And we need to be very, very wary of using schools as places where we just enhance segregation that would be ultimately, and already has been, so damaging, I think, to this society.
So Danielle and Daniel, what are some, just picking up on what we just heard from Diana, what are some of the themes, what are some of the threads that have to be part of the civic education in these schools?
Well, I mean, this is where, again, there's a lot of good work to build on, as Diana is saying. So basic education of political institutions is obviously key, but I think the challenge is that in addition to that, students really need an education that helps them diagnose their social circumstances and understand the relationship between those diagnoses and institutional solutions. That's a harder part of the education, and here there's a really important detail to pay attention to. I think it's in some of the voting data that just came out from Circle yesterday. It's also in the work by Sunshine Hilligus, and this is that students who major in humanities and social sciences have higher rates of participation than students who major in STEM fields. So either we need more humanities and social sciences, or we need to rethink how we're doing STEM education. But we need to collectively recognize that our major policy paradigm driving towards STEM education for the last 20 years has actually hurt us civically. We don't register that often enough. And so I think that has to be a part of the conversation.
Diana, do you want to respond to that before I go to Daniel? Thought about it?
Yeah, I'm really worried about this. I had a conversation yesterday with Nancy Thomas, who heads up the study that was just released yesterday. If you haven't seen this study, it's really a blockbuster, really important, well done research. And it's been tracking the relationship between various things about college students and whether they vote since 2012. At Wisconsin, the difference between the best voters on campus, who I'm proud to say are education majors, and the worst, who are engineering students, is 40 percentage points. Okay, that is huge. And that's not a unique to Wisconsin phenomenon. That was what was reported as a national phenomenon yesterday. When I asked Nancy, well, who are the best voters? She said, actually, the library science students. It's like, okay, good for them, you know. And all 20 of those students are voting. You know, when you look at the millions and millions of students who are going into STEM fields, you know, we really need to work on that. We need to worry about that. We need to do something about that, because what we don't want is for students to be prepared for jobs that are the most economically privileged, at the same time not be prepared to take their place on the civic stage. That would be really, I think, in the short and long term, a disaster for democracy.
Daniel, fold this into what you spent
Sure.
a lot thinking about with regard to partisanship.
Yeah, so building on this, I would say a fundamental thing we need, and I know many people, including Diana, have written at length on this, is the debate and the discussion and the wrangling with these messy issues that divide us. And I would suggest that the core skill that we need citizens to have is the capacity to encounter someone who sees the world differently and to resist the urge to either hit them or to run away, right? That we need to be engaged in discussion. And you know, there were a lot of problems with education in the first part of the 20th century, but there was a very sturdy class called Problems of Democracy that most high schools had, where you actually wrestled with this stuff and students would discuss and debate. And I think one of the pernicious aspects of the polarized environment that we're in is that schools and teachers, with all the other pressures on them, you know, start to shy away from that. Why would we want to have students disagreeing? They might get upset, their parents might get upset. So as they pull back from hosting those kinds of debates and discussions, students don't have the opportunity to pick up those skills in a low-stake contest. And also they kind of come to see politics as something that's boring, because it's kind of fun to debate and discuss stuff. And so they leave school without that aptitude. And thus, you know, they aren't encountering people who see the world differently. It's much more easy to go into the camp, whether it's the red or the blue or this stripe or that flavor, and then to retreat into that and to see the other side as different and a group to be distrusted. So I think we need to recover that vitality in some way.
And they grow up
Yeah.
in the same pattern. Danielle.
So I think that this brings various threads together, and it gets back to the sort of ways in which we need to rebuild the ship while we're trying to sail it. Because to Diana's point about schools being more segregated, or as the 40 years on, schools are more segregated than they were in the 70s. And a lot of that also being ideological points to the underlying residential segregation that the country has fallen into, right? Where that's socioeconomic segregation, but it's also most importantly ideological segregation. And schools, of course, are for the most part geographically built entities. So how do we redesign the opportunity for students to come from different ideological contexts and be in the same space? I mean, that is a kind of missing piece of our institutional structure, even in schools. And so I don't know how we teach those skills, to be honest, without, again, rebuilding that piece underneath so that students have that chance of cross-ideological engagement.
Diana.
So let me give some examples of how teachers in schools have engineered this. One is to not assume that students do agree, because in fact there is often more disagreement among young people than you would think. I'll give you an example. In a study that I did where we looked at 1,001 students in 35 different classrooms, we asked them the question, do most of the students in this class agree about political issues? And in the classes where the students were being lectured to, they said, yes, everybody agrees, and guess what? They have the same views I do. And in the classes where students were in fact being engaged in discussions of highly controversial political issues, even in classes where we would think that students all agreed with one another, in fact, there was a lot of disagreement. And in those classes, students were more likely to say that there was disagreement. So we came away with this suggestion that our job is to activate the students' awareness of the diversity in their midst. And that's probably a good rule for faculty meetings as well, right? We want to make sure that we are aware that we actually do have disagreements, and there's no way to do that unless we're actually talking to one another. But that being said, if there's still more or less ideologically homogenous classrooms and schools, what do you do? Well, two things that I've seen that are very interesting. One is you bring in guest speakers who have very different views than the majority of the students. And I can tell you from our study that initially students often don't like that very much. We interviewed students in a class where every single student believed in protecting a woman's right to an abortion. The teacher brought in a very powerful speaker who was advocating against that right. We interviewed the students a couple days later, and they were furious. How dare he bring in that person who said these awful things? We interviewed those kids 2 and 4 years later, and they said, thank heavens that teacher did that. Because once we got out of the ideological bubble of our community, we actually recognized that in fact there is disagreement about that and many other issues. And that teacher was bringing that disagreement into us. The other thing is programs where you get whole groups of kids who are from different communities together to talk about highly controversial political, domestic, or foreign policy issues. And there's a raft of organizations in this room that put on those kinds of events. And those events really matter. I mean, we have students saying things like, I had no idea students believed that. And it was really important for them to see that because it normalized difference. And what we want, to go back to what Daniel was saying, is for people not to demonize difference. We don't want people to think that because you have that view, you are by definition a bad person, that I shouldn't trust you, or that I shouldn't trust you with authority or power to make decisions for our democracy. And I think the only way to do that is to create what Danielle has so beautifully written about, this concept of political friendship.
Dan, I want, again, as somebody who looks at this at the adult level,
Yes.
bring that down to the younger level, and how, I mean, you've all been talking about it, but what are the skills, what are the most important skills that these young people can learn so that they grow up being able to talk to each other?
Yeah, so I think one of the, just a very concrete thing that in terms of being able to grapple with difference is to have a debate structure, is one example, where students are asked to prepare but don't know which side they're going to defend until the moment of the debate itself. So to kind of to be able to understand both sides and to be able to make the case and understand the weak points, I think that to me is a microcosm of what we're talking about here. The other things that Diana has mentioned, I think also contribute to that. The good news to me, and this is maybe stealing some of the thunder from the subsequent conversations, is there's been a lot of thoughtful people going back to the original civic missions of the schools reports, 15, 20 years ago now, who have identified these practices. So it's less about what should we do, but how do we actually weave those into the schools? And one of the things that I take away, having read the white paper, is a real sense of hope about the progress in places like Florida and Illinois that are taking much more of a systematic approach to this. You can see these practices being woven into the educational system. I think, Judy, one thing that needs to be done one level up from the classroom in terms of what we expect of our schools is to hold them accountable, not just for are they preparing people for the economy or the higher education, if you will, but are they preparing people for citizenship? And that's always been something that we've paid lip service to, but we don't really have accountability measures or expectations to hold schools for account for that. And I think that's one place where we may need some innovation.
Danielle.
I can just push back on one piece of that, which is, the work that is represented in this room is extraordinary, and it's very humbling and unnerving to speak in front of all the experts assembled here. And the work on civic mission of schools in particular has been extraordinary. I guess I would want to push a little bit, though, on the question of whether or not we should take the 2003 framework and simply move forward with it. What's happened since 2003? Well, for starters, Facebook was invented, and all the world of social media, which have dramatically changed the way in which young people encounter civic space. There's issues of media literacy, there's issues of how they form associations and connections with each other, and the sort of, I think, relatively stark divide between their experience out of school with civic life and their experience in school with civic life. So I actually, to be honest, I think we kind of need a bit of a 2.0 version of civic mission of schools, not to replace it, but to build on it, and to take that framework and ask the question of how does it adapt itself in these new circumstances.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Do you have thoughts about how to do that?
Well,
I mean, not at the micro level, but I mean.
Well, I suppose personally speaking, I do hope that that conversation will be one of the things, one of the next steps that emerges out of the conversation today, a sense of a commitment to the need to take the expertise in this room and take the existing 6 proven practices and ask the question of how they should be modulated given the changed circumstances in the intervening 14 years. So that concretely is something that I hope would come out of today.
What about that, Diane?
So I agree with that totally. I was thinking last night about the concept of political climate change, that our political climate has changed dramatically and very quickly. We need to teach that. So we should be teaching about political polarization, the causes of political polarization, the effects of political polarization, what, if anything, could be done with respect to political polarization. That needs to be taught in the same thoroughgoing, highly interactive, high-quality way that we teach, for example, the 14th Amendment. So when we look at the first part of the civic mission of the schools, it talks about the important content that students need to learn. I really do think we need to look at our contemporary, politically changed climate and rethink what that content is. Not that we're going to throw out important things that are, part of our historic legacy. I certainly don't want any student to graduate from high school without really understanding the 14th Amendment. For one thing, I want them to be able to listen to the NewsHour and understand reporting on these unbelievably significant cases that we have before the court this year and coming up, I'm sure, in the future. So we don't need to throw out everything we've taught in the past, but the problem is we keep adding to things. And so we do need, if we're going to add new things, we do need to rethink about priorities. But I'm just really interested in getting a group of teachers together and asking the question, given the change in the political climate, what should we be teaching that's different than what we would have taught 5 years ago, 10 years ago, or 15 years ago? I think that would be a really enervating and helpful conversation.
So Daniel, Dr. Stid, if that's to be done, then what is it about this poisonous atmosphere that young people should be learning about?
It's a good question. Let me think out loud a little bit. Just this is a half-baked idea, but I think it's quite clear, to Danielle's point, that the new social media environment, it's kind of like the Wild West, and we need to, insofar as the parents of 4 children that have all kind of come up through this, I'm just always astounded at the extent to which they are have these diffuse connections at any point in time with all the people that they are connected with online. Thus far, I think the people in groups, or many of the people in groups that have taken the most advantage of that politically, have been like the Ku Klux Klan or the Nazis. It used to be that if you wanted to be a Klansman, you had to go to meetings and stuff, and now you can, in the privacy of your home, be kind of clicking on these pernicious sites and communicating with others. So I think we need to think about ways that technology can be put in harness to expose people to different points of view that would be edifying. This is a small microcosm. I think there's something else about the impersonalization of the online environment that leads to kind of a coarsening of judgments and reactions. This is a small measure. One of our grantees, a researcher at the University of Texas named Talia Stroud, she runs something called the Engaging News Project, has been working rather than the thumbs up or thumbs down in reaction to a particular post of a button that just indicates respect. I may not agree with this, but I respect what you've said or how you've said it. And there's all sorts of, there's not going to be one big thing, but all these marginal shifts or changes that I think over time can reposition things. So I think that technology is a threat. It's part of this new climate. But in what ways could we put it in harness to support these broader, kind of more edifying purposes that we're seeking?
Danielle, I want you to weigh in because you've been looking at digital news literacy.
So, I think there's a lot to say here. So it's true that the social media have permitted extreme groups to coordinate much more effectively, and we've seen that. Europe's seen that. It's a global phenomenon. They have also provided opportunity for young people and students to pursue issues that they care about. So, I think about sort of work in Oakland around a police shooting that did bring the community together on productive reform and change in Oakland. A lot of it did depend on social media tools. So I really think you could have both sides of the balance there with regard to technology. But it's the case that young people need a lot of help learning how to be effective civic agents in this hybrid space, online and offline, that come together. And there are dangers to them. There are the problems of bullying and incivility. They need to be able to protect themselves in that environment, as well as learning how to establish a different kind of norm and ethos in that environment. So I do think that there are those sort of new content areas that need to be integrated with some of the civics teaching that we've been doing for the last couple of decades.
Is digital necessarily always going to be the answer? Or does it have to be part of the answer, Diana?
It does have to be part of the answer. You look at how much time, not just young people, but all of us spend online. I get most of my news online, and I get a huge amount of news through Twitter, because there's links to things, reports, etc. I'm thinking about the big voting report that came out yesterday. There was a huge social media campaign behind that, and a lot of us knew about it because that's how it was pushed out. So it would be crazy for us not to pay attention to that. I do think there's one thing about just what's the form in which things are going out. There's another thing about the quality. And so there's been a lot of discussion for the last several months among teachers and others in this room about how to teach young people about fake news. And I'd like them to teach all of us adults about fake news. But one thing I like to do is not call fake news fake news. That's an oxymoron, right? Fake
Thank
news
you.
is deliberate lying.
Yeah.
And so what I'd like to do is to teach kids to protect themselves against deliberate lying, and not say that by putting news at the end of the two-word phrase that we're somehow edifying it. So there is, I think, a real need to make sure that we not just deal with the form, whether it's digital or more traditional, but we really help people think about how do we assess whether or not the warrants for a claim are strong enough, and how do we protect ourselves from being lied to. And that, I mean that as a nonpartisan statement. I don't think that lying just comes from the left or from the right, but I do think there is something that's different now. It feels different to me than it did 5 years ago, where I think we've got things being pushed out, and that may be because it's easy, it's cheap to push it out through digital platforms, that's designed not to build a better democracy, but designed to do the opposite.
I hope that one of the things that is talked about today is figuring out ways to call out false news, false information when it's false, and not letting it continue, and not, of course, not labeling all news as fake news. We've only got a couple of minutes left. I want to come back to each one of you with your sort of best hope for getting past this. We are at a tough moment right now. This is the toughest it's been in my 40 years in Washington. I've never seen the city as polarized as it is now, and I've never seen the division among the American people as great as it is. So give us something positive, but realistically positive to think about as we go into the rest of this day. Danielle.
Well, for me, it's just the basic concept of responsibility and the invitation to everybody here to take responsibility within their own organizations as leaders. So what does that mean for me? I'm a faculty member at Harvard. I think, and I'm working with colleagues at Harvard to try to get Harvard to step up to the plate in thinking about civics again and connecting the work that we're doing on trying to rebuild the civics curriculum for undergraduates at Harvard with support for teachers in the K-12 space. But it also would be important to me to work with my colleagues there to think about what can we do for Massachusetts. I mean, Massachusetts has a red part as well as a blue part. So Western Mass is very red. There's no reason Harvard couldn't be working to try to, sort of following the Florida model, build a kind of regional consortium that is bringing together people from different communities. That would be a very different kind of thing for us to do. And so I just present that as sort of one example. I think if everybody who sort of got institutional resources tries to think through how they can, in their own space, solve these problems, collectively we would have a very big impact.
Diana.
So I agree with what Danielle said. I think the thing that causes me hope is when I go into classrooms, and I go into classrooms all over the place, and I see young people engaged in high quality civic education, fabulous materials, well-prepared teachers who have had good professional development, and they're doing really interesting work. The kids really like it. I listen to them as they go out in the hall. They're continuing to talk about what had been talked about in class. We know from lots of research that it makes a huge difference. Those young people are more likely going to participate as adults. So I think in every state we have great examples of really high quality civic education. So whenever I get really depressed, which living in Wisconsin happens frequently, I can tell you that I go, there's a high school a mile from my office, and I go into the classroom of this fabulous teacher there, and I watch him build a better democracy, so I know it can be done.
Yeah, I think one thing that we can build on is just the incredible activation of civic life and protest and democratic ferment that has been building over the past several years, but I think over the past year in particular. It's quite clear that business as usual is just no longer acceptable to vast swaths of the public. And that is something that I think that's a starting point. And I think a lot of people have been activated. If you look at the people who are raising their hands and saying, I want to run for office, those numbers are off the charts. Right. And so I think getting a better, and getting people to consider, taking, to pick up on Danielle's word, responsibility. Well, I want to run for office. This is something that I am committed to. I think that is also something that we can build on. I think one thing that we also need to be attentive to is the civic leadership that people in positions of power in all institutions, but I think in particular in government do, the way that unfolds over the country. And leaders can either elevate and uphold ideals that the rest of us can rally around, or they can present things that are take us in the wrong direction. And so the role of leadership and the responsibility of leadership to kind of to take part in the civic education is something else that I think we should be emphasizing and holding leaders accountable for, more so than I think we are at present.
So I think our time is up. I think these three have given you a lot to work on today for the rest of your summit. So please join me in thanking Danielle, Diana, and Dan.
Thank you.
Fabulous.
Thank you.
Really great. Really.